Good afternoon, Hong Kong. Good morning, Europe, and good early morning to the United States, where it's now 5 a.m. Today, I'm joined by Lisa Witter, who is co-founder of Apolitical, an organization which is dedicated to helping public servants to share and understand the sort of insights and ways that they can improve lives of everyone, basically. And Lisa, you've been doing a lot of research around what public servants are learning in the era of COVID and dealing with COVID. What are the main findings you've had?
Well, let me just say it is 3 a.m. In my hometown of Everett, and every Facebook post I ever put, my dad is the first person to like. He has. So at the time of COVID, he's seen a lot of my talks. I just want to say hello to my dad, Bill, out in the great state of Washington, where Seattle was where I first got sort of cut my teeth in government. I started out in politics, Tom, and then I went into government. So I've been a public servant myself, and that's what's really brought me to doing this work, was how we at Apolitical can help public servants. What I would say is there's been so many lessons for government in the time of COVID. We've done some polling, some tracking polling, some early polling in the early days of COVID about what public servants need, tracking polling along the way, also looking at passive data on our site. And then we have a new poll that I'd love to share. I haven't shared publicly publicly, but to a very small group of people. So I'd love to share first here with your audience on some of the findings we've had. But I think one thing to think about before we share the surprising pieces is you remember that people in government are just people too. They're not like bricked, gray-suited bureaucrats. They're human beings with children and their parents and birds and dogs. They're people who often go into government because they have a passion for social change, for service, for helping others, and for doing it at scale. So I just want to personify them. Sometimes when people think of government, they think of these other things, and they're us, they're citizens who really do the work.
Right. Which is maybe why you're talking about public servants as opposed to government.
Yeah, and it's not an accident that we use that. We don't even call them civil service. We call them public servants. Why? Because they serve the public, they're from the public, and it's really about that service. It's about being in service to other folks. So it's not like we're trying to rebrand government. We're just trying to call it how it is. These are people working hard every day to make you safe. And my goodness, imagine if you're on government these days. You know, the buck stops at you, right? All of a sudden, government is bigger. They're taking in more money, and at the end, they're responsible for everything that we're doing, particularly now. So it's quite a stressful time for folks in government as well.
Right. Okay, and what are some of the findings from these studies?
Yeah, sure. So I have some slides you might want to pop up, but so. This is a fun one. All of us are talking about what are the skills that we've had to learn in order to adapt. Now, not surprisingly, government has not been a place that has allowed for remote working. We kind of have 18th century politics, 19th century institutions on 20th century tech, right? So that's what government looks like. So remote working has not been a thing. So one of the number one skills they've needed to do is remote working. Secondly, really, they've needed to be better at communications. That has been a consistent thing in the last 5 years at Apolitical, that folks in government need to be better at communications. And never before has it been important than life and death situations like COVID. So how do we do that? So we've been giving them.
This is externally facing communications as opposed
both.
to...
Both, because in order to have a coordinated response, you have to communicate internally, but the real push is on externally. And then the next two are interesting to me. One is engaging with citizens, which is a trend I hope we'll come back to, that we're seeing a real desire to how do you engage citizens virtually, which is connected to digitizing services. So a lot of things we need to get done, from getting our prescription refilled at the NHS to paying our bills with the IRS if you're in the United States, the taxes. How do we digitize all those services? Now, some countries have been way ahead of the curve in digitizing services, particularly countries who have like very remote places like Estonia, who just rebuilt their government. But other folks haven't been so good at digitizing services. I'm here in Germany, and there's a legacy of not wanting to digitize things because of privacy. So how have they adapted? And we really see that digitization as a big push forward.
So has a lot of digitization has actually taken place during COVID, or people are more seeing the need for it?
Both. So I would say the laggards who have been very wary or just like the old ways of doing things have realize that we have to do it. And it's very, very important. Although, there are some things where human beings are still better at. I know, Tom, you've been working on tracing of COVID. Sometimes digitization can solve some problems, but often you have to blend it with humans. So it's smart digitization of services. So it's really, I would say overall, if there's one word I could use to describe what's going on with government and COVID, is acceleration of innovation. Like all of these things that have been in the pipeline, we see this too with behavioral science. It's been something that people have talked about, but when you need entire populations to wash your hands, you just can't logic people into it. You have to nudge them. You have to change the environment. So there's a lot of these innovations that have been on the precipice, and now they've been pushed over, and it will become the new normal within government.
Right. So this is effective communications, meaning we need to communicate, but then you're also talking about this element of encouraging behavior change and doing it in the places where people are able to communicate these days, which, they were choosing to communicate digitally, but now that's really the only way to reach them.
Right. Well, and if you think about it, if you take apart effective communications, one piece of it is, letting people know facts and information, but the other piece is having them change their behavior. So behavior change is communication. So it's sort of wrapped up in all of that piece there.
And added in there, of course, is fake news and misleading statements and.
Well, for sure. And what we see is there are a bunch of things coming out of COVID. There's one more slide that I'd like to share with folks that we're seeing around priorities going forward, which is really indicative. So if you could go to that next slide. So what would your priority be in preparing for a COVID recovery? I think it's really important to note that different countries are in different places on COVID. So you're in the UK, I'm in Berlin. I don't know that the US is in recovery. We see 40,000 spikes over the weekend. Yet, there are places in the global South where it's beginning to hit. We have friends in Mexico where it's still rising. So I want to be careful about this recovery, but we're moving into that phase. And what's really heartwarming to me, back to our beginning conversation, is that the number one priority is supporting populations hit hardest by the crisis. This was the same result early on. It's the same result now. How do we help elderly people, small business owners? There's really this desire to protect the vulnerable, followed by how do we change the way, preserve the changes and how government works. Back to the other slide, work remotely, communicate more effectively. One of the huge trends that we're seeing, which is great. You and I know each other through the World Economic Forum, and I co-chair the WEF's Agile Governance Council. And we're seeing agility being necessary, and governments are handling it for the most part very well. They're moving into a much more responsive and flexible type of government. And let me give you just 3 quick examples on that. The UAE, United Arab Emirates, had in the past had this 100-day challenge. So they would have to see a challenge in their government. They would pull people together and they'd have to solve that problem within 100 days. For example, they had a high spike in traffic deaths. So in a 100-day sprint, they were able to roll out a new plan that within, I think it was 6 months, reduced deaths by 80%, right? So that's not known in government to do anything that quickly. It takes time, it's slow, it's hard. So the UAE had sort of built a muscle and they activated those learnings. And now agility is the new normal in government. Even in the UK there, where you're at, Tom, which has been hit so hard, the UK Bureau of Statistics, one of our members and someone we know very well, heads up that bureau. And getting accurate numbers on the amount of people that had COVID and died of COVID was critical to, communicating with the public, but also making public policy decisions. They had to be completely agile and work with new partners to get data, because they used to be able to go into places and now they had to look at tracking data and all these other things. And so if there are awards to give out, the Bureau of Statistics. And then finally, the other thing governments need to do.
One second. We go on. We got a comment from Bob Templer, who's saying the idea that government has so much to learn from the private sector is such a tired and worthless trope. Invariably just brings the worst of the private sector, raging corruption, fraud, and lack of focus or value of money into a sector that is far more complex than any business. Self-serving management BS. The intrusion of the private sector into various realms has lowered standards and evasion of responsibility, et cetera. So what is your take on that? This is not a case of we need to transport everything into private sector, from private sector to government? What is your reaction to that?
Bob is absolutely right. I am too sick and tired of the trope that the private sector is always better. And if you just get private sector people, everything would be better. Bob's right in that it's a much more complex system, and the system is much more accountable to the people. Every time we interview someone inside of government, so we have a network of 80,000 public servants around the world from 170 countries, people who move from the private sector into the public sector, they all go in, wanting to serve and kind of thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to bring in my private sector ways. And they all say, oh my God, this is much more complex than we ever thought it was going to be. This is much, much harder. So I completely agree with Bob. We've got, in fact, it's the other way around. What can the private sector learn from the public sector? And that's exciting. That's exciting to me. And we see those lessons like listening. Governments really need to listen to their customers or their citizens, and they're innovating new ways. And that's a big innovation coming out of this, is how do we listen to citizens much more? Tom, you and I both have a connection to the United States and the horrible death of George Floyd and the rebuilding the country needs to do because of systematic racism. The only way that is going to happen in a really meaningful way, if government really listens, public servants really build systems to listen and rebuild the country with those voices side by side with policymakers. So trust is everything.
It's not going to be some quick bullet solution from Wall Street or the private sector that's going to bring that about.
And it's not even like just pass a law. You have to rebuild brick by brick with the people on what trust looks like and what a society looks like. This is deep stuff.
Right. Okay, back to some of the priorities for the recovery. A lot of elements of education. Education is something that's become an obsession for those of us who are parents. And right now, should our children go back or not go back? So many of these sectors feel like they're going to need to be rebuilt.
Yeah, they are. Well, let's hope they're being rebuilt. We are in close contact with the folks in Finland. Basically, in a lot of countries, what's happened is a flipped classroom, right? So much more learning at home, and then you check in with your teacher versus the teacher all day telling you what to do. And so there's research now being done in the field. Is that a better way to do it? Is it better to use the teacher as a checker versus an instructor? And how do you use the role of the internet? So I'm really hoping there'll be some innovations that better match the minds of our kids today, and just minds in general. A couple other sort of trends that we see that are important to point out. I mean, obviously you see here racial equity as a big deal, gender equality as a big deal, all of these things. The thing that may not be so obvious and are really drivers of democracy, which is something I care a lot about, is the role of misinformation. I love everyone who are listening right now. I know you're a former journalist, Tom, to just quit using fake news. It is a horrible phrase, because what it does, it gives credit to people who are discrediting news, and we need news to really keep us safe. And if we are not watching very carefully the role of disinformation, you've already seen in places like the US, because the president talked about drinking bleach, people started drinking bleach, right? Even, and it spreads very quickly. And you're going to see this big push with the anti-vaxxers. We're going to have a real hard time getting people to fully vaccinate because of the anti-vax and the disinformation about anti-vax. And this is such, I don't need to say it, people know now, but it's such a viral disease that if we don't get vaccinations, it's going to continue to spread. So disinformation and global collaboration with governments is absolutely paramount.
It's not fake news, disinformation.
Disinformation. From now on, everyone just call it disinformation. It's really, really important. No more fake news. We need solid news. The other thing that I really want to point out is my country has an election coming up in November, and we saw earlier in a primary in the United States in a state called Minnesota that the elections move forward at this time. And imagine sort of asking people to go to the polls at the time of COVID, like really, put their health and safety in check. We need to be very, very thoughtful about how to use mail and online voting, maybe for the future. I come from a state that has had permanent vote by mail for a long time, zero to no corruption. We have to innovate systems, and COVID's an opportunity to innovate better election systems, safer and more fair and more inclusive systems. So we're seeing really this great stuff happening. The other just last sort of big point to make, I think, is that there's some slides, Tom, I shared with you where we see a change in trust in government.
Okay, so before we go to that one, though,
yeah,
just a final one on the list of what people want to preserve, what the learnings coming out of it. It was very interesting to me that number 2 on your list is preserving the change. So that means basically people are recognizing that things weren't the way they should be, and in fact, it's a good crisis. Obviously not in the big ways, but there are good elements of this crisis that. There's a sense from public servants that we need to preserve these going forward. And I think that's a very interesting and more, it's an element of optimism being shown into this very negative global situation.
Well, massively. And for those of you who don't think about the role of the public servant very often, which, why would you, right? We often think about policy. But it's not enough to have effective policy. You need to have the right skills, mindset, and tools of the largest workforce in the world. This is 200 million people. If they don't have the skills and motivation to do their job, you could have the best policies in the world and they're not going to work. So we're really excited to see that there's a real sort of a renewed focus in governments around those skills and tools that the folks in government need to do their job. So that's super exciting. So trust. Trust is this word that gets bandied around. Do you trust government? Do you not trust government? And I'd really, one of the things we see here is that in May, the Edelman Trust Barometer, people have been dumping on government for quite a long time. And I would argue, of course, there's always reason to, but there's a lot of news or disinformation about the role of governments. Of course, different in different places, yeah. But you could see here that something interesting happened in May, and this has a little bit to do with behavioral science, but a little bit to do with the different responses around the world. And I'll show you what's happened. So you can see that government has moved ahead of NGOs and business as trusted. So why has this happened? Well, I hypothesize that my background's in brain and behavioral science, and what happens is you kind of love the one you're with. If you know that song, and you begin to want to love the institution that is most important in your life at the time. And we have not seen this in our lifetime, maybe from the previous wars of other generations where government has been so important. But if you could go to the next slide. So government's trusted, one in between there, yeah. And that's even the case with countries that have had a overall how should I put it, difficult response or not so good response. So even in the United States, trust numbers have gone up. Now, this is before George Floyd and the protests, so I don't know what those post numbers have been. But you can even see that happening, is that people are going, oh my God, government, we really need them to be doing their job. But I think the real story, Tom, and I'm going to ask, I already asked the audience once to quit using fake news. I'm going to ask them to do something else. I'm going to go to the next slide. The next slide, I'm going to ask you all to quit saying two things. One, quit saying, oh, you can't trust government. Obviously, if you really believe that, that's the case. But there's a huge difference between the role of the federal government and the state and local government. And you can see here, even this research shows this, that people are more likely to trust their local government. Why? Again, back to brain and behavioral science, where trust sits in the brain through all the brain research is in the part of the brain that is triggered for proximity. So the closer you are to something, the more likely you are to trust it. And this is what I'm hoping is going to happen out of COVID. And I think we're going to need this in many ways for climate change adaptation, is that the federal governments are going to need to begin to be at the service of local government. We have a friend, Hillary Cottom, who wrote a book, Radical Help, that talks about redesigning the welfare system. People's lives are impacted on their street. They're not impacted at Whitehall or DC. Of course, the policies matter. But if governments would see themselves in service of the day-to-day lives and their role with national security and international cooperation, but there's been way too much focus on the federal governments. This is my opinion. This isn't Apolitical's opinion. And what's interesting, so I'm going to ask people, quit saying, oh, you can't trust government. Say, you can't trust what part of government? And is that even true? Really interrogate where that's true. Maybe you don't like the people in charge of the politics. And there's a difference between the people politically in charge and your career civil servants. So at Apolitical, we think of the democracy flywheel, right? Citizens are the power of the flywheel. The politicians are the hardware. But then there's this important software, the operating system, and those public servants, there's a lot of extraordinary people doing amazing work despite political tumultuous times. And the countries that have done the most, so best response, look at Germany, New Zealand. There tends to be, it seems, a gender factor, but we haven't done the research on that. But there's a lot of great leadership from women right now, and there's a whole reason around this. But the ones who have good political leaders, more trusted political leaders, seem to have a better response. So when people say to me, you can't trust politicians, it's not true. What politicians are we talking about? And if we keep saying that over and over again, you can't trust politicians, what sort of politicians are we going to get to run? So we're kind of getting what we deserve in many places if we don't kind of help bring in the best and brightest into politics and government. So quit saying you can't trust politics and government, and quit talking about fake news. Let's go fix it.
So basically what you're saying, you're advocating a more of a nuance in terms of how we talk about the challenges government faces. This is not really an issue of government is bad. Let's speak about what element we're talking about this challenge.
Yeah, and if you think about all the things every day that work in our lives, right? I mean, most of the things are working quite well. Yes, COVID has pointed out inequality. That is something that is not working well. We know that. Yes, climate is a big issue, but there are so many things that are working well. Can they be working better? Yes, but by denigrating the role of government all the time instead of going in and fixing it, again, we're going to get what we deserve. So highlighting what's working and having a bit of optimism about things being better, I think that's a driving value for me. I know it's a driving value for you, and it's what we need right now.
So can you speak a little bit, what's fascinating, you've shown those are the changes under COVID times. What are the things that people might be surprised to hear about the points of view or perspective of public servants even before going into this crisis and their role?
I think what you would be surprised probably is, I've touched on some of this, but how dedicated to their jobs they are. They spend money out of their own pocket to re-educate themselves on a regular basis. We do a lot of training, online, virtual, social learning, and we do that. And what's interesting about that is all of our research shows that the tools and the skills that they get within government aren't the ones that they actually need and want now. So that's surprising, right? Here we are, 200 million public servants. Are we serving them so they can serve us? And the answer has been not as much as we can be. The other thing that's quite interesting is I want evidence-based policy, right? Policy that someone has tested somewhere or carefully sort of rolled out, not on a full population, but maybe so we can learn. And public servants find it very hard to find evidence, which is one of the reasons we created Apolitical. For example, the World Bank, important institution, 1/3 of their reports aren't even clicked on once. So here's a massive evidence base. We don't have a problem with evidence being out there. We have a matching problem, right? How do you find real-time information in the right way? And the other thing that public servants said that I found, again, back to brain and behavioral science, is not surprising, but it might be surprising to people listening, is they care about experts, but what they want to meet first are other people and other situations in government. So they're peers. They really want more peer-to-peer support. And that hasn't happened in government. It's been about, here's the great old expert, or here's business, but there hasn't been the connection of someone running digitization in Estonia with someone running digitization in New York. That hasn't happened as much. So we can bring those linkages together, use the best of tech to bring real-time knowledge together and really help with those skills, you're going to see a leapfrog in the abilities of government to respond to the needs of citizens. And we need it now with climate change and COVID.
So really what you're talking about is there's the education. They're really keen on education. They love the evidence, but it's a connection issue. And the third one is they love to connect with peers and learn from them and what is the right ways to do it. In terms of the education front, what are the areas that you have found the most demand and interest in the education that you provide, which presumably is reacting to the demand that the public servants have.
Absolutely. Yeah, we spend a lot of time asking them what they need. So I say there's kind of verticals and horizontals. So on the knowledge front, the role of AI, the role of digitization, kind of anything in that sort of new frontier, or people might say the fourth industrial revolution, really tech and data and AI driven, and climate change and things like sustainable financing, those sort of facts, knowledge things. But on skills, it's really basic stuff, right? People who go to public policy school get good at analyzing public policy, but they may not have good skills in managing and writing and being a good public speaker and learning how to run effective meetings. I mean, these are basic things that all of us in our lives want our managers or our colleagues to be good at. So it's a lot of upskilling on those basic things. I would say right now, there is a pretty intense desire for really genuine, inclusive engagement of people in their communities. There's a real desire to how do we listen better? Because if we don't, we're really in trouble. So how do you use technology to do that? How do you actually get over your own biases? I mean, imagine if your job is to reduce racial and gender inequality, and you have a workforce who has their own issues with conscious and unconscious bias. How are they going to put that forward? So there's a lot of work on public servants doing their own work first before they can go out and do the other work.
Interesting. Fascinating. Any concluding thoughts on this? As you said, the phase of where we are in COVID varies a lot according to where we are. Some places seem to be moving beyond it, frankly, and others are just heading into the hard zone. But any concluding thoughts on from the perspective of public servants as we continue with COVID in the various levels at which it's hitting us?
Now, I would say that two things. One, well, big picture, let's step back. There's a lot of conversation about how do we build back better? How do we make a better new normal? Now, change doesn't happen through osmosis. It happens through hard work. And you can't just have great ideas. You actually have to do the hard, slogging, boring work to make it happen, right? It's a new spreadsheet here. It's a new meeting methodology here. It's rolling out tedious, a new policy here. And I guess my point is, a better world post-COVID will only happen if all of us make it happen. It doesn't automatically happen. It takes really hard work. And a very important part of making that happen is supporting public servants and going out and voting for people who are going to make that change permanent. We can't sit back as citizens and just think, oh, it's up to those people. We have to be very active. And I've been surprised, Tom, traveling the world, the last 25 years and being a person who's always loved politics and find it beautiful. And I know that's kind of a creepy, weird thing to hear from people these days, but I find my voice in the future of our world beautiful, right? Like this is how it's supposed to work. I don't want to live in a different way where my voice and your voice and everyone's voice isn't heard. And the lack of civic knowledge that the basic citizen has is really shocking. So what you can do is remind yourself how your government works, remember to go vote, maybe thank a public servant for doing a good job these days. It's tough stuff. And get, and maybe give people the benefit of the doubt. Quit calling it fake news, and try to have a little optimism as we go forward.
Great. Excellent. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Hey, Tom, one last thing. Yes. For those folks, maybe Bob, who earlier joined us, who wants sort of a weekly dose of optimism, we have a weekly briefing that highlights the best of what's working and the trends. And it's kind of a weekly little version of this every week. So I'll share it on the social media links for those folks who listen if they want to sign up and have that optimism and get some direction about how to support government.
So where do they go to get that?
Here, I'll put this, I can put it in the right now in the little window here. And I can also put my, here we go, live comments. Oh, it's not letting me. Here, I'll give it to you.
Okay, apolitical dot.
Here we go. It's a special one I made for today. And then if you could share my Twitter handle, that would be.
That on WhatsApp, but it's straight up.
Private chat.
I sent in private chat. Okay, great. Great.
Weekly briefing takes 5 minutes, guaranteed dose of optimism, and share it with public servants in your life and just with people who care, particularly now. It's important.
Okay. We will share this. It's not going to be terribly legible here.
Okay.
on the link.
It's a bit.ly link. Can you see that?
Yes, which is not going to be clickable if I send it through, but I'll share
okay.
which I should have done anyway. So let's share that as we're concluding this. There we are, Lisa M. Witter,
Awesome.
And we'll share the bit.ly link in comments and in the actual postings themselves. Thank you so much.
Stay safe, everyone. Stay safe and take care. Yeah. Thanks, Tom.